psychopathology there, does it matter? Does it matter to treatment? I don't know whether anybody has questions along those lines.
So I'm just puzzling over Dale, your model, and how the boys kind of followed underneath the girls really in their trajectory. And bearing in mind what we found that there weren't any gender differences in play here, do you think that there's any advantage to trying to get the girls and boys to cooperate more so that they integrate more? Will the girls lift the boys up and therefore reduce psychopathology, for example? That's the kind of idea going on in my mind at the moment. It's like, does that matter? I mean, yeah. So I wonder what your view is.
I think that the gender segregation is coming from the children and reinforced by adults. So it may be coming from these preferences to play with particular objects, to play in different ways, to find it easier to cooperate with members of their own sex. But it's also underscored in certain kinds of educational situations where teacher calls out, girls line up here, boys line up there. So it's a marked dichotomy in life, and children gradually become aware of their own sex, their own gender during the early childhood years. It becomes part of who they are. So how you have any strategies for appreciation of each other's activities, whether that would make any difference or not, I'm not completely sure. What I do think is that it's worth tracking the maturational lag if it's coming together. And I do think that girls' precocity, as I think I said this morning, but it might have just been to individuals this morning, girls' precocity seems to be a protective factor early in childhood, and it's a risk factor as you move towards puberty. So being on that faster trajectory may have some different consequences at different points in childhood. And then the question is, in this middle childhood year that we've been studying with the 7-year-olds in different samples, that's a point where, just in a year or so, you're getting the internal early pubertal processes. So children are moving on to being adolescents before they actually reach their teens. I do think that because a lot of our studies have been based in schools, we are forgetting about the fact that families are not segregated by gender, that sibling relationships may provide very interesting and important things, and also other extended family relationships like cousins and family gatherings. And I think as developmental scientists, we've perhaps not looked at those kinds of outside of school-based or in lab-based assessments. So I think I was very struck in one of the talks this afternoon about we have this measure at this particular time, and girls do this and boys do that. And I was reminded of one of the most famous gender difference studies from the 1960s by Michael Lewis and Jean's book, Gun. And this was a very famous study in the US that got a lot of press. And they, in those days before scrutiny by, too much scrutiny by they had this paradigm where they separated, it was in a laboratory playroom, they separated the child from the mother and put a fence, and there's very famous images, the boys struggling to pull the fence down and the girls just weeping. What's less known, that was studied when they were 13 months old in that state, what's less known is they published a follow-up study from the longitudinal analysis somewhat later in the second year, and at that point, the boys were standing there weeping and not fiddling around with the fence, and the girls were just like getting out of their business because they, on understood that the mother was still there. And so what you had that looked like a striking sex difference at 13 months was maturational differences. The boys hadn't yet got to the stage where they would cry. And so it really is important, I think, for all of our students to think about assessing these trends, to not cherry pick our measures, to start maybe coming up together with some battery of informative measures that might be sensitive to gender difference, but also might be sensitive to gender similarities. And I think as long as we're all just setting up our studies on our own, this is a great occasion today for thinking of a consortia of measure development. But then, of course, the measures have to be culturally sensitive to the cultural context in which these longitudinal studies are taking place. So this is a great way to start thinking about these issues, but I think we should be very cautious about not confounding gender with other dimensions such as education. And maybe not rushing too hard to intervene on the basis of single findings. Maybe get some perspective across samples and across contexts.
Thank you. Thank you all for that as well.
I just had a question about this country I come from, gender preference for particular gender child is a significant factor in developing the depression, prenatal depression. And it also influences the kind of caregiving that the child receives based on gender. Do you have any comments in terms of this? Is a lot of significant decision in terms of psychopathology which exhibit both nature and aspects. So when a child is brought up in a particular kind of mind based on the discrimination based specifically on the depression. So how do we kind of raise the point of culture so that would have an additional effect on the second?
Wait, who wants to take? I'm not going to be the only person talking.
I didn't hear the question. Can you just...
So what's additional effects of culture? Because of gender preference. So sorry,
Yeah, I think the issue is about if a mother who herself has been kind of perceives that she's being discriminated based on her gender and then gives birth to a child, probably a female child, and then the discrimination continues. And the care is also provided in a differential way because the child is female. So would that be able to contribute? I think Jonathan.
Well, that's one of the questions we're trying to answer. So I suppose the question is, do we have a hypothesis? I mean, the simple one presumably would be. So,
Yes.
I mean, we are asking the mums in your study, aren't we, about their recall of indices of gender preference, whether they would prefer, whether their brothers were preferred or male cousins were preferred. So we're looking for variability in the recalled experience of gender preference in relation to their parenting. And I suppose we would predict that those who had the experience of not being preferred might pass that on, but you could equally well make the case they might try and reverse that. It has seemed, hasn't it, a very important question in your setting that we believe isn't an issue here. I have to say, this is for tomorrow, really. It's very interesting because in devising those questions, building on the parental bonding instrument, of course, we realise we don't have a comparison condition because we've never asked the British mothers about their experience of gender.
Well, there is one sample in that, and that's exactly how the
No, but so we've adapted it.
Oh, I see.
So we've added to the PBI to ask questions about a recall of, so for the girls, recall of male siblings or cousins being preferred. And of course we asked the boys whether they recall their sisters, female cousins. So we have a control condition within the Indian sample group.
But not in the UK.
We don't, unless you've got gender preference in your sample. The very
Because the population that is presented in South London study, there was 2% of Asian population that is there when you study.
small proportion of Asian.
Yeah, very small.
Okay, it was quite a small number of Asians. This whole issue is kind of very prominent in the Southeast Asian population, so that's the reason for us it's important.
And I've got a little question for Dale following on from it. Do you want to use the mic?
So in your presentation, Dale, you found that there was relatively low cooperation between mixed-sex dyads when they were having their little peer play thing, that boys cooperated and girls cooperated, but boys and girls didn't particularly cooperate. And I'm just wondering, given the findings that were presented just now about what parents rated children enjoying, it seemed to me that the ratings overall were quite high for outdoor activities, and I wondered whether boys and girls might get on better outside than inside. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's probably true. But first of all, the cooperation in mixed-sex groups was around 50% of the groups engaged in cooperative play. So these were ways we define different forms of cooperative play. It might be simple exchanging. These are two just approaching their third birthday. So it could be simple exchanging of toys. It could be cooperative pretend play, which was fairly common. It could be the cooperative problem solving with a task the children generated. This was all in free play. So half of them, the mixed-sex groups, are doing it. And again, most of the groups were mixed-sex. There was relatively few that were just girls. It happened to be striking that 100% of them were able to cooperate, but about almost 70% of the boys. So the important thing there is not whether girls are more cooperative or boys are less cooperative. It's that, is there some incompatibility in a mixed-sex group where perhaps you don't get into schemas? So, for example, if you are interested in certain kinds of activities, for example, tea parties, which was probably the most engaging cooperative activity, by either sex. There was an awful lot of drinking of fake tea and pretend croissants and things. But that's a very practiced kind of activity with friends at home. Then that gives you a platform for interacting. And maybe there's just some of the schemas are easier to negotiate or to make it exist in this rather unusual context where you're at least one parent, because it was a birthday party, and many example really got into the spirit of this. Extended family members came to the parties, ultimately baby siblings came to the parties. So there's a lot going on, and maybe there's just something about the mutual interest with the same-sex groups that they were able more easily to communicate, to get going on one of these cooperative activities. It's important to know that the conflict was the same across all the groups. So we're not seeing cooperation as opposite as conflict, but both forms of social interaction. Conflict, there was at that age, there was very, very little use of physical force during the conflicts. So it was mainly kind of argumentation and cooperation, kind of, like today, really.
Shilpa?
I don't think we can get away from the fact that the male-female ratio in terms of mortality, morbidity, neurodevelopmental disorders is definitely there to stay, and it is not any kind of fallacy. I mean, there's no doubt at all about it. And a lot of women are aware that the male child, as Geeta says, is precious. There may be some evolutionary issues about it being precious because they tend to die or be morbidly ill far more than the rather strong female. So I'm wondering whether there is something to this in terms of evolution, in terms of genes, in terms of epigenetics, I don't know what, but it's clearly there. That's one part. So I think it matters in that sense. We are managing it in the psychosocial manner. A lot of the discussion today is about how society deals with it, how do we deal with it, kind of thing. So that part I think requires a lot of basic science research. But I just wanted to ask whether it is true that there was a study apparently that girls and boys, when separated, study better, learn better in school, and that it might be a good experiment to separate the sexes when they are in school so that learning is better, and that I don't know whether there is any evidence for this, but I know that there are schools who went on to attempt to separate and found that the grades improved. I just want your...
I mean, the first bit I do think is very important. If it's true that the adolescent vulnerability of girls is the flip side of their resilience, then the question is what turns the resilience into a vulnerability? And I think we probably agree that it's ahead of symptomatology. It's something that you might pick up at 4, 5, or 6. And it's interesting because actually there was some data in Liz's PhD that didn't go into that paper because we didn't quite see how it fit, which I thought was very interesting, which was in the girls. Higher maternal cortisol also predicted more smiling.
Oh.
And to my mind, the increased emotionality and the increased smiling are part of this broader sociability. But I'm supposing that girls under some stressful conditions, so this isn't just a simple gender difference, this is linked to stress. So you've got this potential for increased social, emotional, physiological reactivity that is almost certainly, I would argue, part of that female resilience. And the question is it a matter of, in very crude sense, too much, or is it only under some conditions in the interface? And of course, I mean, one of the things I often think is our longitudinal studies are somewhat sanitized because we don't get a handle on abuse until later on. So we know that in the Wirral study, by now, 10% of the girls have been sexually abused, and by 16, 20% will have been. But we can't ask them that yet. So there is this question of the interface between this, and I think that is really important. And as you say, the thing about the boys' difficulties, because the boys are, in that sense, the vulnerable group, and I did suggest, there are evolutionary hypotheses about why that is needed, as it were, as well part of the selection process. They become apparent earlier, and they call attention.
Yes.
I think, well, I was going to respond to 2 points. I think I'm right there. I think that some of our analyses on the South London study showed that the girls who were very pro-social were actually too pro-social. So that eventually, in adolescence, they became the ones with the internalising problems and I haven't looked at the 5-year-old, but certainly we have.
It's true for pro-social children generally.
And so
it was actually more true for boys. That pro-social boys were particularly vulnerable to emotional problems.
But I was thinking about this increased smiling, that actually it's not always a good thing to be overly smiling. And that perhaps can be a vulnerability as well as a protective factor. Because I've forgotten what I was going to say there. But we do have, in Britain, we divide up, often many of our schools are boys and girls.
Okay.
But it depends what your outcome measure is in terms of success. If you're talking about academics, it might be. But in terms of
social,
you're
this was academic.
mentioned about the evolutionary basis of this greater vulnerability of male fetuses, but there's some great work. I don't know if you mentioned the work of Vicky Clifton earlier on in Australia, looking at maternal asthma as a model of maternal stress, and showing that females show much more dynamic change in placental function and gene expression in response to that stress, whereas males kind of maintain a set level of gene expression in the placenta, and that kind of fits with this idea that they propose that it's better for the males to be born bigger and fitter, whereas the females can be a lot more dynamic and can be born small as long as they can go on to bear children. I think it's interesting thinking about those epidemiological studies of severe stress. There's been studies done, for example, like 9/11, where you see the birth ratio shift ever so slightly towards female rather than male after those stressful experiences.
Just coming from a clinician's point of view, really, because we've got longitudinal studies for two reasons. One, it would help me explain and discuss some of the developmental aspects with our families and patients, so that we have a shared understanding of how the problems have come about, how they arise over time, and what factors have influenced. So in that sense, I think understanding the basic sciences have been really helpful, so that at some level we have a better understanding of that. The second aspect why we look at longitudinal studies is to see how early one can intervene, and what can we do early enough to stop the psychopathology from progressing. I think that's a bit more tricky, I've heard, because we are far off from, say, identifying clear markers early on, either genetic or otherwise, which would predict. We do have early interventions at a much more generic level, like reducing parental stress, perinatal psychiatry, increasing support, and reducing family conflict, etc. But gender-specific interventions early enough, I find it's still not there. I wonder if the panel had any ideas or views about where one can intervene with the knowledge we have at this time. About intervention.
So shall I repeat the question? So what are the implications of what we've heard today and the state of the knowledge really about whether we can recommend gender-specific interventions?
I was thinking about what Salim presented, and whether we are in a place to start putting up gender-based hypotheses with treatment implications. Because I was thinking, is it possible that when boys run into trouble, let's define that fairly broadly for now, that they do less of what they tend to do? So in this case, the infusing the objects, what was the expression? The boys do more of animating objects. Is psychopathology associated in boys with animating objects less? And is it associated with managing the play more in girls? In other words, are there some themes that we can pick up on? And to my mind, one is boys, as it were, being underactivated and girls being overactivated. If you start to formulate the questions about psychopathology in that way, then you're starting to get a bit closer to the treatment implication. I think there's a step in between what we're doing now and what you're talking about, because we've got to ask the questions now from a more therapeutic point of view, and that would be an example. We can actually quite easily identify even data on that, whether girls with symptoms were more managing and boys with symptoms were less animating.
I think it's really important to realize that there's variance as well as average trends. And that if you went to having very different therapeutic approaches for the two sexes, what happens these are overlapping distributions on almost all of these measures. What happens to the children who are at one end or the other of their distribution? What I think is that this isn't something that should be prescriptive, but it's also perhaps helpful therapeutically to use information of the sort we're collecting, like responses to particular forms of stressors. Are they in a kind of gender predictable or a more idiosyncratic individual pattern for that child? I think we have found a number of cases today where we don't find gender differences. We find some cases where we find an interaction with gender and something else. And we find some cases where we found main effects of gender, which seems to be at different points in the lifespan, so we don't even have a pattern necessarily across all the samples we discussed today. One of the main problems we have in psychology is we're still wedded to the difference test and statistical significance. And if there's, we can't accept the null hypothesis. So if I don't find any gender differences across 2 samples on the CBCL, we can't conclude that there are no gender differences on that measure. If you find, all sorts of null results in this literature just get disregarded. Isn't this a time, any statisticians in the room, isn't this a time to start using Bayesian analysis to find out how plausible the no difference hypothesis is versus there's a difference? And I think there's also perhaps some time for more meta-analysis to see if there is any pattern, or are these things swamped by individual idiosyncrasies of given samples and sampling frames. It does seem today, just in a very formal way, it does seem that gender differences show up more in samples that are exposed to more adversity. But I'm not sure that's even true, because we don't have any gender differences hardly in aggression in the South London study, which is a highly exposed sample. We have gender differences in other things. So it's really time, I think, to bring some sophisticated approaches, and I would say basic approaches, to seeing how plausible is the null hypothesis in this particular realm at this particular age range across samples. Do you want to use the mic?
I was just thinking, I agree with what Dale has been saying, but I think maybe to think a little bit clinically. And now I bring my experience of working on a mother and baby unit with the mothers with severe mental illness and their newborns and up to a year. And I mean, it's very clear to me that we don't look at boys and girls separately. We look at what they bring, that particular infant, and look at their behaviour, for example, in the NVAS or whatnot, and actually help the mother to notice. I think that's what I feel we need to do. And I think that my job on the mother and baby unit as the developmental psychologist was to actually help the mother regulate her baby's emotions, irrespective of whether it's a boy or a girl. And I just think that we should be looking at the individual and not necessarily splitting it into boys and girls.
I think to the point about, and Jonathan mentioned it as well, it's very difficult, whether it be the pro-social behaviour, the play behaviour, or whether it be methylation of a certain CPG. At the moment, we don't have kind of like the optimal range. Like if you think about obesity and BMI, there's kind of these acceptable ranges for trajectories over time and development. And at the moment, we don't know what's optimal for predicting later outcome. And without that, it's difficult to implement interventions when you don't know whether or not they fit within an acceptable range or not.
I think there was a gentleman at the back.
has been replicated and replicated and replicated. And to the point where now there is at least one colleague who's developing a lifestyle chip, picking out drinking related to CPGs, smoking related to CPGs, to develop a kind of profile that would be used for likelihood psychometric testing for people that are joining consultancy firms. But we're just not there yet. I think with the research that I was mentioning earlier on, I personally don't think we'll ever get to a point where we'll have a DNA test and we'll say this kid was abused, or I think it will just add to our capacity to predict vulnerability, but I don't think it will replace conventional risk factors or risk profiling.
Just that I would agree entirely with you. I can't see a day, but anyway, not in my lifetime. Or in yours?
No, sounds very sensible to me.
I think we've come to a natural pause. I'd like to thank all our speakers today. It's been really, really enthusiastic and fascinating. I suggest we all adjourn to a bar somewhere. I know we've finished on time. We've discussed an awful lot of issues. We're all hopefully coming back tomorrow for another day. For those of you who'd like to join, please come to the Philharmonic Pub. It's not far away. And some of us are going on to a conference dinner starting at 7 o'clock, so we'll be in the pubs for that hour in between. Or at least I will. I heard Jonathan say that spa was cool before, wasn't it? And for those of you who can't join us for tomorrow, please could you fill in your feedback sheet to give us some idea of what you thought about today's talks. And thanks ever so much for coming. It's been really good event.